This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Great, ladies and gentlemen, good evening, and welcome to this fourth lecture in the Canning House History series. I'd first of all like to thank the Institute for the Study of the Americas for their cooperation, their collaboration in putting together this lecture, and for their hospitality here at the University of London Senate House. For those of you who don't know, I'm Peter Polycarp, a trustee of Canning House, and also, appropriately enough for tonight, a former British ambassador to Brazil, because as you know, today we're moving from having had 3 lectures in this series discussing the Aztec and Inca civilizations and then the Spanish conquest, into actually looking at the what I might call the sort of the very large hole in the historical canvas, which is colonial Brazil. I say a hole because it seems to me that all too often people manage to talk about the history of Latin America with somehow Brazil not quite being there, and we don't want to get into the definitional problems of what is Latin America and what isn't, but sort of turning, if you like, the history of Latin America into the history of Spanish America. And sometimes even those who are interested in Brazil tend to sketch over quite briefly, or even in caricature terms, those 300 years of history which are actually the colonial period in Brazil. So in order to tackle that, it's a great pleasure and a great honor that we have here the eminent historian and Brazilianist, Professor Kenneth Maxwell, to fill that particular hole in the historical canvas for us. Professor Maxwell will be well known to many of you, I'm sure, if only by reputation. He's had a long and very distinguished, and I think on occasions one might say colourful academic career, including 15 years as the director of the Latin American program at the Council on Foreign Relations, and latterly as the founding director of the Brazil program at Harvard's David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies, if I've got the title right. I'm also pleased to note that Kenneth Maxwell has recently donated what I think is only part of his library to his alma mater, which by chance happens to be also my alma mater, St. John's College in Cambridge. And also very happy to know that that's actually, I think, started a little bit of a revival in the interest in work on Portuguese-speaking countries, studies of the Portuguese-speaking world. So, without more ado, I will ask you to welcome Professor Maxwell and invite him to give his talk. I think he will talk for something like 40-45 minutes. I think you'll stay there so that we don't have a lecture, but we'll be sitting down. After which I hope we'll have some time for question and answer and for discussion, while still leaving a little bit of time to continue the discussion over a glass of wine, which I'm told will take place in the foyer behind us. And I'm conscious that one of the organisers is standing at the back and he's not pointing his finger at me at the moment, but I have forgotten the one piece of housekeeping which the chairman has to do, which is that in the event of an untoward accident or fire or whatever, the escape route, I am told, is through the door we've just come through, avoiding the lifts, and down the big staircase, which you may have been so energetic enough to walk up rather than take the lifts. But with that little bit of housekeeping, let me hand over to Professor Maxwell. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter, very much. It's a great pleasure to be here at Canning House and the Institute for the Study of the Americas, and I thank them for the invitation to participate in this interesting series. Colonial Brazil. In interpretations of Brazil to begin with. Brazilians are a complex ethnic and racial mix, made up of people originally from Europe, from Africa, and from Asia. And there was also a strong Amerindian component, which was important throughout the colonial period. Brazil was not an empty country when the Portuguese first arrived in 1500. The Patacos of Porto Seguro, descendants of the original inhabitants who have miraculously and unexpectedly survived, much as the Wamapau Indians, equally unexpectedly and surprisingly, still survive on Martha's Vineyard off the coast of Massachusetts, decided in the year 2000, on the anniversary of the arrival of the first Portuguese, to construct a makeshift memorial of their own on the spot where the Portuguese had stepped ashore and celebrated their first Mass. This provocation greatly annoyed the local Brazilian authorities. They sent in the military police to destroy the memorial, which provoked more than 1,000 self-styled survivors of colonialism, they called themselves, to march in Brasilia, Brazil's inland and modernist capital, to protest what had happened and still happens to Brazil's indigenous population. The Portuguese, grown eloquently, called the new territory they had encountered in South America the land of the true cross. It soon became known by the more prosaic name of the Brazil wood tree. The Portuguese quickly found that there was a ready market for the Brazil wood tree's scarlet dye among the European textile weavers of Flanders. By the middle of the 16th century, the Portuguese were also importing enslaved Africans into Brazil. These slaves worked in the sugar plantations the Portuguese settlers established in the rich alluvial soils around Recife in northeastern Brazil, around the Great Bay of All Saints in the Recôncavo of Bahia, and around the Bay of Guanabara close to the city of Rio de Janeiro. African slaves were to form the backbone of Brazil for the next 4 centuries. In 1888, Brazil was the last country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery. And Brazil also remained a monarchy until 1889, long after the American Revolution had established the first independent republican government in the Western Hemisphere in the late 18th century, and the Spanish colonies had thrown off Spanish rule and established republican governments in the early 19th century. This long persistence of slavery, monarchy, oligarchies, and monoculture in Brazil all had major influence on the development of Brazilian society in mores and self-perceptions, as well as influencing Brazil's relationship with the wider world. In the 20th century, these historical continuities from the colonial period inspired 3 influential interpreters of Brazilian history: Gilberto Freire, Caio Prado Jr., and Sergio Buarque de Holanda. Freire, born in Recife, in northeastern Brazil, was educated in the United States at Baylor University in Texas, and at Colonial University, where he worked with the anthropologist Franz Boas. He was a sociologist, anthropologist, and historian. The popularity of his books is not surprising. Few equal his readability, his rambunctious, meandering, infinitely varied, and deeply erotic interpretation of the formation of Brazilian society. In the Tropics, Freire claimed the Portuguese had established what he called a polygamous patriarchal regime. The Portuguese, Freire said, practiced miscegenation, in other words, the masters had sex with their slaves. And this tended to modify the enormous social difference, Freire said, between the big house and the slave hut, and produced generations of mixed-race children. At the beginning, these slaves of mixed-race origin were Amerindian mothers. Later, their mothers were Africans. But the mixed race, or pardos as they were called, that is brown slaves, were a very important part of colonial society from then on. Freire's 3 volumes, The Masters and the Slaves, first published in 1933, The Masters and the Shanties, The Mansions and the Shanties, published in 1936, and Order and Progress, published in 1957, sought to encapsulate Brazil's social development by examining witchcraft, medicine, the composition of households, the role of food, clothing, and sexuality, behavior, and the social impact of forms of economic organization. Freire was never a Marxist within an intellectual milieu where Marxist scholars tended to set the agenda. And Freire's ideas provided the intellectual foundation for the ideology of Tropicalism, which the Portuguese dictatorship of António de Oliveira Salazar in the 1950s and 1960s hijacked and used to justify Portugal's continuing war to retain its colonies in Africa, claiming that the Portuguese, unlike the Northern Europeans, were less racist. Freire was flattered by the attention. He was also much criticized when he embraced the military regime in his own country after the military coup of 1964. Yet Freire's interpretation had an enormous impact both within and outside Brazil, and after a temporary eclipse, his reputation recently has revived. Caio Prado Jr.'s Formation of Contemporary Brazil is essentially a study of late colonial and early national Brazil. First published in 1942, Caio Prado Jr.'s book was not translated and published in English until 25 years later. But when it did finally appear in English in 1967, his interpretation had a major impact, certainly on my generation of postgraduate students, influenced as we were by the American Civil Rights Movement. Caio Prado Jr. was born to one of the great coffee-producing families in Sao Paulo. His grandfather had been the greatest coffee producer in the world and was a prominent figure during the Brazilian First Republic, established after the abdication of the last Brazilian emperor, Pedro II, Pedro II, in 1889. Caio Prado Jr. spent a year in England as a student and graduated from the Faculty of Law in Sao Paulo. He was an early supporter of Getúlio Vargas. The disillusioned with Vargas' dictatorial regime, he joined the Brazilian Communist Party in 1931. And in 1933, he traveled to the Soviet Union, and the following year published a book called The Soviet Union, A New World. He was later imprisoned for 2 years after the failed communist uprising in Brazil in 1935, and then lived in exile in Europe. He returned to Brazil in 1939, and after the Second World War and the fall of Vargas, he was elected as a communist representative to the Brazilian Congress. The military coup of 1964 saw him again in prison. Caio Prado Jr.'s work placed Brazil's development within the history of European colonialism. He described Brazil's role as a producer and exporter of tropical and subtropical products, sugar, tobacco, rice, and cotton, to European markets. He looked at the role of slaves, and he examined the growth of mining and the growth of domestic markets. He examined cattle ranching, the development of transportation networks, and the role of state administration. He was interested above all in examining the moment when the colony became a new nation, teasing at what he called the sentido, the sense of Brazil's evolution. The works of Sergio Buarque de Holanda are complex, sophisticated, organic view of settlement and cultural development influenced by Max Weber. Born in Sao Paulo, Sergio Buarque de Holanda was a journalist, historian, sociologist, and literary critic. He was a newspaper correspondent for Brazilian newspapers in Germany between 1928 and 1930. His first book, Raízes do Brasil, The Roots of Brazil, was published in 1936. He examined the multiple cultural influences from the Portuguese, Spaniards, Africans, and Native Americans, which were transformed into a uniquely Brazilian consciousness, a transition zone, Sergio Buarque called the process. Following Weber, he established pairs of ideal types, the worker and the adventurer, the seedsman or planter, and the builder, in the archetypal Brazilian, in which he defined it as the cordial man. This was not intended as a compliment, since it defined a person incapable of separating the private from the public. The book was only published in English last year. His second book, Monções, on monsoons, was published in 1945. It is a history of the Paulistas and the mixed-race Mamelucos with their fleets of canoes, which explored the river systems of the interior, delineating what Sergio Buarque called the river-borne highways, where the Paulistas adopted indigenous methods, foods, and fishing, and fighting techniques. Between 1953 and 54, Sergio Buarque lectured in Rome, and after 1956 he taught at the University of Sao Paulo, where he directed the Institute of Brazilian Studies. He was always an archival scholar par excellence. His vision of paradise, his Visão do Paraíso, Eden, the discovery and colonization of Brazil, was published in 1959, and it examined in a marvelous mix of erudition and detailed archival research the magical, Edenic, or Eden-like attributes of the new plants and animals discovered in the New World, and the Christian symbolism used by the Jesuit and other writers of the time to interpret them. Sergio Buarque de Holanda was the first Brazilian I met. He was visiting the United States. It was in early 1965 in Professor Stanley Stein's basement office in Princeton during my first year as a graduate student. This was shortly before my first visit to Brazil. I only wish I had been better prepared to understand all he had to say. His teenage son, Chico Buarque, accompanied him and sat quietly in the corner. Chico Buarque would later become one of Brazil's most famous composers and musicians, a leading figure in artistic opposition to the Brazilian military dictatorship, and most recently, a very well-received novelist. Gilberto Freire, Caio Prado Jr., and Sergio Buarque de Holanda lives spanned the 20th century. Gilberto Freire was born in 1900 and died in 1987. Caio Prado Jr. was born in 1907 and died in 1990. Sergio Buarque de Holanda was born in 1902 and died in 1982. All three men were interested in understanding and interpreting Brazil's colonial past. One, Freire, was influenced by American anthropology and sociology. Another, Caio Prado, by Marxism. And a third, Sergio Buarque, by Max Weber. And they were all writing at just the moment when Brazil was on the verge of being transformed from a rural society, still dominated by many colonial characteristics, into the modern, industrialized, and largely urban society it is today. But when precisely did Brazil become Brazil? In many ways, Brazilians preceded Brazil. That is, Brazilians became conscious of themselves long before the country formally declared its independence from Portugal in 1822. As members of colonial society, they had mobilized to defend their self-interest, most importantly during the mid-17th century, when during the period Portugal had lost its independence to Spain between 1590 and 1640. The challenge of the Dutch was most acute, and Portugal lost control over much of northeastern Brazil to the Dutch West India Company, while losing control over the Rwanda in Angola. The Dutch challenge was global in extent, and the Dutch West India Company was able to seize the major sugar-producing regions of northeastern Brazil on one side of the Atlantic, and the major source of African slaves on the other. The Brazilian composer, Antonio Carlos once said, "Brazil is not for beginners," and there is much truth to this aphorism. Brazil presents multiple faces to the world. Its history does not conform to the Latin American stereotype. Brazilians today are rediscovering themselves, and this process of national self-examination can at times be a painful one, since it can provoke a struggle for historical memory, especially by previously repressed or underrepresented groups seeking to find a voice in the national dialogue. So that as Brazil's society democratizes, along with traditional heroes of the past, many long-buried embarrassments resurface: the role of slaves and slavery, for instance, the need to come to terms with Brazil's multiracial and multi-ethnic past, to take account of the gruesome story of the violent repression of messianic peasant movements in the arid backlands of the Northeast, and to take account of the consequences of the destruction of the Atlantic rainforest and the consequences of the ongoing assault on the rainforests of the vast Amazon basin. Brazilians, like Americans, tend to think of themselves as being members of a young country. In terms of the age distribution of the population, this is statistically true. But historically speaking, the assertion of newness is misleading. Brazil, in fact, is a nation of very considerable historical debt. The first European settlers on the Brazilian coast predated by almost a century and a half the arrival of the English settlers in Massachusetts. Brazil achieved its independence a century and a half before the European colonies in Asia and Africa shook off European rule. In 1500, Pedro Alvarez Cabral stayed a little over 8 days. He was keen to get on to Asia, the objective of his powerful fleet of 13 vessels and 1,500 men. Lisbon was eager to follow up on Vasco da Gama's voyage to India between 1497 and 1499, and to consolidate the Portugal's preeminence over the new maritime route between Europe and the spice-rich coast of southern India at Cochin. There are usually good records of the finding or ascending of Brazil. Two letters written at the time by observers were sent back to Portugal by a ship dispatched from his squadron by Cabral to take the news of his discovery back to Lisbon. The most famous, by Pedro Vaz de Caminha, written to King Manuel of Portugal on May the 1st, 1500, was the first description of Brazil's Amerindians. It was ecstatic in its description of the bronze inhabitants who welcomed the Portuguese mariners. The Portuguese were especially astonished by the Amerindian women, who seemed to the Portuguese to exhibit no shame or embarrassment at all at their nakedness. They seemed to be a people of such innocence that if one could understand them and they us, they would soon become Christians, Camino wrote. For it is certain this people is good and of pure simplicity, and that they can easily be stamped on them whatever belief we wish to give to them. The Portuguese left behind 2 convicts to do the stamping, as well as 2 cabin boys who jumped ship, before Cabral's fleet continued around the Cape of Good Hope into the Indian Ocean and up the east coast of Africa and across the Indian Ocean towards Malabar. The people of the new land, King Manuel told the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabel, were viewed as in the first innocence, gentle and peaceable. It seems our Lord miraculously wished them to be found, because it is very convenient and necessary for the voyage to India. For Brazilians, Ascendento can also mean a bargain. In many respects, Brazil was, at least as far as the Portuguese were concerned. But Asia remained the main focus of Portuguese attention in the 16th century. Brazil offered little by comparison, certainly no developed societies or spectacular commercial opportunities to match those the Portuguese had encountered and quickly exploited in the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. There are estimated to have been at least 5 million indigenous peoples in the area of Brazil in 1500. But they were rapidly affected by European and African diseases and increasingly were first inland. But for the first centuries, the Amerindians were an important presence in colonial Brazil. The Portuguese crown did reserve a monopoly of the Brazil wood trade and contracted it out to a consortium of Lisbon merchants. And in 1532, the crown divided sections of the Atlantic coast of Brazil into lots ranging from 100 to 400 miles in length and granted them to 12 recipients as hereditary captaincies. Only 2 of these captaincies achieved any real success. And in 1549, the crown was forced to dispatch a substantial colonizing expedition to Bahia and to appoint a governor general, Tony de Souza, who established the first direct rural administration, bringing with him a staff of functionaries, craftsmen, soldiers, 400 convicts, and the Jesuits on their first mission to the New World. At first, Brazil was seen by Europeans as a Garden of Eden, which is why Sergio de Lavanda called his book of Elysian Paradise. Amerigo Vespucci, in his famous letter to Lorenzo di Medici, written from Lisbon in 1502, which became one of Europe's early bestsellers when published in 1504, spoke of a people who lived without money or property, without trade, within total social and moral freedom, without kings or religion. Sir Thomas More's Utopia of 1516 was inspired in part by Vespucci's vivid description of Brazil. But the demonic myth, with its fear of backwardness, degeneration, and cannibalism, was not far behind. The first published illustration of Brazilians appeared in Augsburg in 1505, a hand-coloured woodblock print depicting brown men and women in feather bonnets, fondling each other, happily chomping on human legs and arms, and smoking body parts over a fire prepared for a feast. The caption, borrowed from Vespucci, said, "They fight among themselves, they live 150 years, and they have no government." Even the long-suffering and patient Jesuits despaired at times of the indigenous peoples and their capacity for serious application. The Jesuit Father Anchieta observed in 1586, "Nor does the country help of itself, for it is relaxing, slothful, and melancholy, so that all the time is spent in festings, parties, in singing, and in merrymaking." Despite Cabral's holy aspirations for Portuguese America and its biblical evocation in its name. Commerce triumphed. The barter system of the early years, the contact between the indigenous population and the Portuguese, proved inadequate to provide labour services for the colonists, and the Portuguese turned to coercion, cash crops, and imported African slaves. The original inhabitants of Brazil had in the interim become known as Indians, in which even Cabral knew perfectly well they were not. Unlike the deluded Christopher Columbus, who persisted in believing he was in Asia while marooned on Jamaica in 1503, Pedro Alves Cabral was in 1500 after all, on his way to see real Indians and in India. By 1590, Brazil did replicate the early patterns of the Portuguese settlement in Madeira and the Spanish in the Caribbean. The decimation of the native inhabitants by disease and exploitation was followed by the introduction of sugarcane worked by slaves imported from Africa. But in Brazil, this intrusion, pestilence, and population substitution took place in a territory of continental dimensions and was to permanently influence the composition of Brazilian society, the possibility of economic development, as well as Brazil's early integration into an export-oriented, monocultural, and Atlantic-facing commercial system. By the early 17th century, Brazilian sugar dominated European markets. The Jesuit Antonio Vieira described the Brazilian sugar mills with their sugar cane grinding machines, their fires, and boiling cauldrons as a very mirror of hell. African slaves came to provide the backbone of the rapidly expanding Brazilian sugar economy. The hands and the feet of the sugar planters and of the senhores de engenho, the lords of the mill, was how the Jesuit Antonio described them in his treatise on Brazilian natural resources published in 1711. Brazil had by then become the largest recipient of African slaves in the New World, and it remained so for the next 300 years. Yet Brazil was not only composed of slaves and sugar. The system of extensive land grants of set by years, and the growing population of displaced Indians, mixed-race people, either mestizos of Amerindian or European origin or mulattoes of African and European origin, as well as poor whites, produced a growing population, which, although it often existed outside legal frameworks, nevertheless created a highly dynamic and growing society in motion. Often these people were artisans in the various port cities, which grew up from Belém and the mouth of the Amazon, in Maranhão and Recife, Bahia, and in Rio de Janeiro. These Brazilians were both free and slave, or subsistence farmers on the poor land between the rich soil of the sugar plantations and the backlands. This new Brazil also looked inwards towards the gold and diamond mines of Minas Gerais and Goiás in the 18th century, to the inland river systems of the Amazon basin, and to the upper tributaries of the Paraná, to the cattle ranchers, squatters, and bandits of the backlands of the northeast, to the settlements of escaped slaves or quilombos, some of them quite substantial and organized, or the King gauchos, tending the vast herds of cattle on the plains of the south, or on the cattle ranches in the San Francisco River Valley. Hell, Eden, and Utopia. Brazil at times seemed to be all these things. But these images serve to hide a real world of struggle, territorial settlement, and the amalgamation of races, out of which a new civilization was emerging, which was increasingly independent of the earth. So how and why is Brazil different? As a Portuguese-speaking linguistic space, Brazil was for over 2 centuries little more than a series of coastal enclaves, connected more easily by sea than over land. These enclaves, especially Pernambuco and Bahia in the northeast, saw the development of the major export crop of sugar. And for almost 2 centuries, Brazil dominated the world market in sugar. Sugar brought millions of Africans to Brazil to work in the cane fields, and established an intimate link between Brazil and Africa, which via the slave trade would lasted for 350 years. Brazil received the largest number of slaves of any country in the Western Hemisphere, and continued to do so until the mid-19th century. This early and continuing engagement with international trade, both transatlantic and with Asia, made Brazil from the beginning an outward-looking country, sensitive to world markets, world commodity prices, and to world politics. The struggle with the Dutch in the 17th century and the eventual victory of the Portuguese inland struggle for Brazil and Angola was achieved by a multiracial coalition of mobilized Bahamian and Pernambucan Brazilian militias, assisted by mixed-race militias from Sao Paulo and the South. This mobilization of the Brazilians of all racial groups against the Dutch was not forgotten by the Brazilians or by the Portuguese. It made the Portuguese very cautious and attentive to Brazilian interests, at least most of the time. And when the Portuguese disregarded Brazilian interests, they were made to pay for it. Brazil's first historian, Friar Presente de Salvador, writing in 1627, said that the Portuguese settlers and their African slaves scratched the coastline like crabs. But this was about to change. By the early 18th century, some leading Portuguese statesmen argued that it was better to accept the inevitable, that Brazil was bigger, richer, and potentially more secure than Portugal, and it was time to recognize this fact of life and to plan for the removal of the central government of the Portuguese Empire to Brazil. The port cities have by now become complex societies with monasteries, bishoprics, religious brotherhood, all racially divided, but nonetheless important participants in civil society. Quasi-banking institutions existed, which made loans to the sugar companies, sustained credit and investment, and held religious ceremonies. There were parishes and priests, and militias existed also on racially defined grounds, but they were very prestigious. The most prestigious of all in Bahia and Pernambuco was that of the Henriques, named after Henrique Dias, the black hero of the resistance to the Dutch. By the mid-18th century, Brazilian territorial expansion into the interior of South America connected the two great river systems, the Amazon Basin and the upper tributaries of the Paraná River. This vast incorporation of geographical space, and much of the incorporating lands that remained unsettled and unexplored, formed an inland river-defined frontiers of Brazil, a type of hollow frontier, to be sure, but a frontier whose vast South American geographical extent was formally recognized in 1750 by the Treaty of Madrid between Spain and Portugal. The Portuguese built a series of fortresses to protect and delineate these inland frontiers. By the mid-18th century, Brazil's geographical dimension was assured, and in essence, the frontiers of Brazil are what they remain to be still today. This was over a century before the United States, for example, expanded across North America to the Pacific Ocean. In 1763, the capital of colonial Brazil was moved from Bahia, where it had been since 1549, to Rio de Janeiro, which reflected the impact of the first great gold rush of modern history, which had brought a rush of people from the coast into the mountainous interior and consolidated inland settlement in Minas Gerais and Goiás. Rio de Janeiro became a major port through which African slaves reached the interior of Brazil, and through which gold after 1700 and diamonds after 1720s reached Europe. Gold production in Minas reached its apogee in the 1750s. By 1800, the largest number of Brazilians lived in Minas Gerais. And just as sugar had dominated world markets in the 17th century, in the 18th century, Brazilian gold dominated world markets and brought immense wealth to Portugal. Pope Francis is the first Latin American pope. He is also the first Jesuit pope. The Jesuits in Brazil have a long history, which the Jesuits have certainly not forgotten. During the 18th century, it was from Brazil that the Jesuits were first expelled. The frontier between Brazil and what would later become Argentina was one of the key locations of the conflict which pitted the Jesuits against the crowns of Portugal and Spain. Under the terms of the Treaty of Madrid, the land of the 7 Jesuit missions previously under the control of Spain would become Portugal. The treaty envisages the evacuation of the Uruguayan Jesuit missions and the Guarani neophytes, as well as over 1 million head of cattle across the Uruguay River. The Jesuits opposed this, and the Jesuit missions took up arms. A joint Spanish and Portuguese military force was sent to defeat them. Pombal, who was the principal minister in Lisbon at the time, and his brother, who was the governor of Pará, were also in conflict with the Jesuit missions in the Amazon. And as with the Guaranis in the south, in the Amazon, Pombal intended to emancipate the Indians and to encourage their intermarriage with European settlers. This collided with the most basic philosophical tenet of the protectionist policy of the Jesuits. The Pombals were supported by the Brazilian colonists, for whom the Jesuits had long been confident over access to Indian labor. The Lisbon Earthquake of 1755 aggravated the situation. In 1758, a failed assassination of the King of Portugal provided Pombal an excuse to crack down on aristocratic and Jesuit opposition. The Jesuit Gabriel Marigrida was in 1761 accused of complicity and was sentenced by the Inquisition. He was the last person to be burned at the stake in Lisbon. Pombal then sponsored a virulent campaign throughout Catholic Europe against the Jesuits. In 1773, Pope Clement XIV, the Franciscan friar, suppressed the Jesuit order. When he died unexpectedly the following year, it was rumoured that he had been inadvertently taken poison, disguised in his chocolate drink provided by the Jesuits. Pope Francis knows this Jesuit history, as did the cardinals who elected him. They joked that the new Pope should take the title of Clement XV. The Jesuits did not return to Brazil until 1841. As independent nations emerged in Latin America in the early 19th century, after 3 centuries of Iberian domination, the rise of Brazilian dominance within the Portuguese Empire had become a preeminent political issue. It was to produce a unique Brazilian solution. Brazil, at the time of its independence in 1822, was already 322 years old. And Brazil's experience as a nation free of Portugal is still far shorter than was its colonial life. Yet in Latin America, the systems of colonial social and institutional structures was quite unlike that inherited by many post-colonial societies that emerged out of the European empires in ancient Africa during the mid-20th century. Socially, the impact of Spain and Portugal within the Americas had been much more disruptive and hence more permanent than was the impact of the Europeans who had imposed themselves temporarily, as it turned out, over ancient civilizations from the Middle East to China, where populations, religions, social structures, and behavior patterns, and where societies were never uprooted or destroyed as catastrophically as they were in the ancient civilizations of the Americas. By the end of the 18th century, the Brazilian population numbered about 2 million, over 300,000 in Minas Gerais, 116,000 in Sao Paulo, 215,000 in Rio, 288,000 in Bahia, 239,000 in Pernambuco, 55,000 in Pará. After the Second World War, and particularly where there was no large-scale white settler population to complicate the transition, Africans and Asians achieved independence by negotiating the removal or by first forcibly expelling the handful of white soldiers, overseers and administrators that ruled them. In Latin America, on the other hand, it was precisely the white soldiers, overseers and administrators who expelled the representatives of the Spanish and Portuguese crowns, while continuing or usurping the overlordship of a large non-white or indigenous population, or African slaves. Latin America is not thus fully comprehensible if it is only seen in the context of the new post-colonial nations which came into existence as the French, British and Dutch empires collapsed between 1945 and 1965. In this sense, Brazil was indeed a new world in the tropics, as Roberto Freire put it. A settler society which had become rooted in the new world, and where the population of European, African or indigenous origins was sufficiently intertwined to be not easily resegregated. The extraordinary depth and impact of Spanish and Portuguese colonialism in the Western Hemisphere was such that post-colonial nation building became intrinsically a very incestuous affair. Unlike Spanish America, however, Brazil was at the time of its independence did not fragment into a multitude of weak and at times anarchic states, nor like the rest of the Americas, with the exception of Canada, did Portuguese America become independent with republican institutions. The opening of the Brazilian ports in 1808 to the trade of all friendly nations was the first action taken by the Portuguese court after its arrival in Brazil, having escaped from Portugal just as General Junot, at the head of Napoleon's army, arrived on the outskirts of Lisbon. It was an action that ended 3 centuries of mercantilist practice, where Lisbon had been the obligatory entrepot for all Brazilian products. It was a pragmatic measure aimed inevitably at the continental blockade imposed on British goods by France. The important political point is that Brazil became economically and politically emancipated between 1808 and 1820, while acting as the center of the looser Brazilian Empire. Brazil became independent in 1822 only after Rio de Janeiro had been for almost 20 years the center of the empire, to which subjects of the Portuguese monarchy in Europe, Africa, and in Asia, as well as elsewhere in Brazil, looked for leadership. This unusual experience explains why in 1820 it was Portugal that declared its independence from Brazil, and only afterwards, in 1822, that Brazil declared its independence from Portugal. The Manifesto of the Portuguese nation to the sovereigns and peoples of Europe, which was issued by the rebels in Porto in 1820, reads very much like declarations of independence from colonial status by rebels in America, and contained the same complaints. The only difference was that this declaration of independence was made by rebels in a European city, not by rebels across the Atlantic in the colonial port city. It read, "The Portuguese are beginning to lose the hopes of the unique resource and the only means of salvation that remains to them in the midst of ruin which has consumed their dear homeland. That the idea of the status of a colony to which Portugal is in effect reduced afflicts deeply those citizens who still conserve a sentiment of national dignity. Justice is administered from Brazil to the loyal people of Europe, that is to say, at a great distance, with excessive expense and delay." But if the anti-colonial revolution took place in Porto and not in Rio de Janeiro, the interesting question from a Brazilian perspective is as follows. Was the will for independence in Brazil sufficiently strong to have achieved this outcome if the liberal revolution had not taken place in Porto in 1820, and if the king had not been forced to return to Europe as a result? Was anti-monarchist sentiment in Brazil strong enough to provoke a republican movement in Brazil, like in North America or in Spanish America, which rejected both monarchy and European rule? These questions are not only theoretical. Republicanism had been central to the ideological thinking of the Minas conspirators in 1789, who had taken the American Revolution, the American Declaration of Independence, and the American constitutional documents as models for the independent republic they intended to set up had their plot succeeded. The plotters in Bahia in 1798, and those in Pernambuco in 1817 and 1820, all had republican objectives. All these republican movements, however, were, or could be interpreted as being regionalist revolts against centralized authority and a threat to the territorial integrity of Brazil. The centralized monarchical system, moreover, had established a very strong institutional presence in Brazil after 1880. In fact, the Portuguese monarchy had instituted in Rio de Janeiro almost all the founding institutions, usually the task of a post-colonial government: centralized administration, superior law courts, a national library, schools of medicine and law, a national press, a national bank, a military academy. The government had negotiated international treaties, had sent envoys abroad, and had received envoys at home. It had established what it called a United Kingdom of Brazil and Portugal, and had overseen the marriage of the heir apparent, Dom Pedro, to the Grand Archduchess Leopoldina of Austria. George Cannon observed in 1825, "The difference between the relation of Portugal to Brazil and that of Spain to her Americas is nothing more than this: that all the Spanish colonies have gained in spite of the mother country, but that Brazil has been raised to a state of a sister kingdom instead of a dependency by the repeated and advised acts of policy of the common monarch of Portugal and Brazil. Up to the period of the immigration of the royal family to Brazil, Brazil was as strictly a colony as Mexico or Peru or Buenos Aires. From that period began a series of relaxations first, and afterwards of concessions of privileges, which gradually exalted the condition of Brazil and almost inverted its relationships with Portugal. so as to make during the residence of His Most Faithful Majesty Brazil, the mother country, in fact, independency. There was therefore no question of the Brazilian regime's legitimacy. The European powers had wished to see monarchy, as well as the unity of Brazil preserved. When Dom Pedro declared Brazil's independence in 1822, he had taken the flag as the flag of the new Brazilian Empire, the combined colours of the yellow of his Austrian wife and the blue of the Braganças of his father. As George Cannon told the British Cabinet in November 1822, to refuse to recognise Brazil would not be, as has hitherto been the case of the Spanish colonies, an act merely negative. For we have with Brazil established relations, regulated commercial intercourse, in agencies, if not actually political, affording channels for political correspondence. We cannot withdraw our counsels from Brazil. It is obvious that we must continue to cultivate commercial relations with our country.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, there's huge amounts to absorb in that. Thank you very much, Kenneth Maxwell. I think we'd all sort of rather like to hear it again, or preferably have it on our iPod. That will be sort of slowly absorb it over the next few days. We do have time for questions, comments, discussion. Who would like to open up? So,
Professor Maxwell, thank you very much. There's a lot to digest there. Just 2 points. I'm already saying that basically the point that's always struck me is that unlike Spanish America, of course, Brazil remained one country, and putting that down largely to basically the monarchy moving over from Portugal. And the second thing is really, of course, Britain's prime role. In fact, it was the British Navy that escorted on that extraordinary journey the entire Portuguese royal family over to Brazil so that they could escape the clutches of Napoleon. Did the British really know what they were doing? I mean, all of them then getting short-term commercial or very long-term commercial advantage. Did they really see Brazil as becoming one country? I mean, was Cannon's vision widely shared?
No, I think it was. And the thing is that the British really only accompanied the thing is the Portuguese were prepared to leave. It's a very important point. They didn't suddenly rush to the ships in the harbour. The whole fleet was there. The archives of the state were there. And they brought... There's some dispute about how many people came. The highest number is 15,000. That's probably too many. But they all came in Portuguese ships. The British Navy was there to make sure the royal family got on the ships. Because if you remember, the year before, or something like that, 6 or 7 months before, the British fleet had bombarded Copenhagen because similar type of circumstances that occurred. So there was an intention on the part of Brazilians to move, of Portuguese to move, and they were prepared. The British were there to assist them or to attack them if they didn't. I mean, there was 2 sides to it. I mean, they didn't have much choice, but they did it. I mean, it was amazing. So, but the British policy changed earlier on, probably by 1821 or 1802. There'd been a good deal of thought about the movement to Brazil, and the Portuguese had earlier on had been from, I think it was da Cunha in 1712 or 13 at the time of the Treaty of 1720, 1713 was the Treaty that was Utrecht. He was the Portuguese representative of Utrecht. At that point, first said that it would be much safer for the Portuguese monarchy to be established in Brazil. They wouldn't be subject to Spain and all these European influences. So there was a long background to it. So there's a combination of circumstances, kind of planning, but also the fleet was there to make sure they went. But the British were only accompanied them to the Azores, I think, and then they went on their own.
I think some of the fleet went
someone came back.
Yes.
So there's somebody near the back who was wanting to ask a question. In front of you, Joe.
Well, actually, I had that's almost the question I was going to ask. So maybe to follow up on that, I sort of asked why has Britain not been able to sort of follow up on that early relationship and trade to the point that we are today, despite the efforts of some very good diplomats, really almost sort of irrelevant to modern Brazil as it sort of takes a new role in the world stage.
No, I mean, one must remember that Britain did very well out of the arrangement. I mean, the opening of the ports to the world, to all friendly nations, was only one friendly nation. I mean, all the other nations were non-friendly because Europe was closed by the Napoleonic blockade. And the British thereafter, for most of the 19th century, dominated the trade and commerce and the investment and the railroads and all these things. It was only in the period of the First World War when the US began to come into Brazil, and then it was actually only in the 1930s and 40s that the US became the dominant force in Brazilian relations. So the British had a very good innings, so to speak, in Brazil. I mean, the ambassador can say more about currency.
I don't want to say anything about current circumstances. I think the fact is that the United Kingdom, as quite a lot of Europe, actually lost sight of most of Latin America on the onset of the First World War. I mean, the only thing they were interested at that time was sort of corned beef from Argentina or southern Brazil to feed the troops. I mean, it actually took most of 100 years for the attention to come back. And one hopes that we're seeing a bit of that now. We may, in the long term, feel that there is a return of attention and focus. But let us focus back. Let's go back to the colonial period. Was there somebody else who wanted to ask a question? Right there. So, the microphone's coming.
I just want to make sure that I understood if you have said that the Portuguese want to become independent from Brazil, rather Brazil become independent from the Portuguese. Is that right?
Yes.
Can you just clarify it to me?
It's a complicated situation, but after the Wellington, the Wellesley and everybody was involved in Portugal. I mean, and Portugal was in effect run by the British. I mean, this was part of the complications of the 1820 revolt that took place in Portugal. It was as much against the British as it was against to get the king to come back from Brazil. But I mean, the interesting thing is that all the literature, if you look at it, and all the manifestos are exactly as you think they would be from the United States or from Brazil. You have to reverse your thought process to understand what was happening. And I mean, again, getting back to the contemporary circumstances, in the Portuguese-speaking world, Brazil is the largest component. I mean, it's this huge component still, and is relatively prosperous, and Portugal is not at the moment. So there may be some regeneration of these thoughts, I'm not sure. But the British were very anxious that I didn't mention the 1825 treaty, which recognized Brazilian independence. The British were very anxious that Brazil, the Angolans, wanted to remain with Brazil in 1825. And the British said, no, we have to separate. So the fact that Angola remains with Portugal, remained with Portugal, was a British intervention in 1825 because the Angolans wanted to remain connected to Brazil, mainly because of the slave trade. So there's a whole new history. There's a whole history to be thought about in these terms, because the history's become separate after 1825, and Portugal gets into a whole series of civil wars and things, as you know. And Dom Pedro, the first emperor of Brazil, goes back, takes his titles, his Pedro VII of Portugal. So there's a complicated picture there. Thank you very much.
There are, good.
I'm thinking because when I have a study in university, I did the same question to my teacher. They said that Portuguese was afraid because they're going to be Napoleon maybe going to get involved with Portugal or colonials. If he gets involved with colonials, but they get independence, and then they make sure that they're going to get the Brazilian states. I think is
in the 1820s.
Yes. Before 1822.
So you had a question, comment?
Yes. Could you say a little bit more about the three theoreticians that you interestingly identified as formative thinkers in terms of Brazil's developing history? Perhaps their respective merits, contrasting interpretations, but still influential ones. And I was particularly struck by the way you described Sergio Yolanda's description of Brazilian personality as the cordial man, but you said that wasn't a compliment. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? It's a rather intriguing observation.
It is, and people who haven't read Sergio Buarque assume that it's a compliment, but it's not, because it's intended to go back to his Weberian origin, the dual type of personality, and he sets up a series of contrasts between various types. And the cordial man is essentially to describe why Brazilians are incapable of separating the public sphere from the private sphere. And that, Sergio Buarque believes, explains a lot of the problems of Brazil and a lot of problems of foreigners dealing with Brazil, because the cordiality hides the reality of the social relationships and the racial relationships and so on that goes on. So it's actually quite a subtle critique of Brazilian personality or mores. And that was what it was intended. But people don't read the book. And they think the cordial man is a marvelous thing. So Fernando Henrique Cardoso was very pleased to be called a cordial man, not realizing, of course, that it was in fact an insult. That's unfair to say.
Can I ask a little supplementary to that? Because why did he see this inability? What was the root of his inability to separate public and private? Because in my mind, and I think in some other people's minds, it's also linked with another aspect which you mentioned, which was the, if you like, the captaincies, or what one might call the sort of outsourcing of sovereignty, which the Portuguese did as a way of a small, poor country trying to manage a very large continent. I mean, are those two linked in that analysis or not?
They are in these three. I mean, the interesting thing is all the three people that we were talking about, Sergio Buarque, Jorge Freire, Claudio Virginia, are trying to explain the colonial persistence. I mean, and they take different aspects of it. They don't really deal with the issue you're dealing with, I think, the question you have, and that is the incapacity of Brazilians to separate the formal state aspects of the law and their behavioral patterns, and the private and personal, the public and private. I mean, there is a very good anthropologist who's written on this. What's his name? Roberto D'Amata, who looks at the history of carnival and malandros and all this, brings this up to date. And he also somewhat supports the notion that Brazilians have the capacity of separating these things. I'm not entirely sure that myself, that that's the case. I mean, I think this is part of the mythology of Brazil, actually.
Can we pull you out on one other aspect to those three analyses which you mentioned at the beginning, which was this issue of some miscegenation, of intermarriage. I mean, were you or were they saying that also had something to do with the multiracial, the harmonious sort of racial mix, if you like?
It is in all of them. I mean, particularly in Gilberto Freire was a great interpreter. I mean, he saw this as, it's very interesting. I mean, one has to remember that I mentioned they're all very much 20th century figures. They're all very much 20th century. And they were beginning to write in the 1930s, the late 1920s, 1930s. And they were saying that miscegenation is a good thing. This was the period when Hitler and Europe was going in the opposite direction. So there was an element that and there had been a strong racist and eugenic influence in Brazil, among thinkers in Brazil up until the 1920s and 30s. So they were all very revolutionary people in turning that on its head and saying that the fact that Brazil is a multiracial population is a good thing. And Freire said this in 1933 or 34, which was, in the context of the time, was a remarkable thing to be saying. And Jorge Amado, the great novelist, also wrote this. So, but it was a taking of that Brazil was a racial democracy in a sense. It led to that feeling. Now, part of the problem is that, of course, it was an elitist view. I mean, it was a white man's view, looking down, so to speak, on society. Now, I mean, one of the things I was saying about as Brazil becomes democratized and as people of multi-ethnic and multiracial background become participants in the dialogue, they don't believe Brazil is a racial democracy. And it's not just the US influence, which people tend to think. It's the fact that they are expressing themselves. So there's a great debate now about quotas in Brazil, in universities and so on, in the press. And it's become a very fraught issue. So Gilberto Freire has gone through various images. I mean, he was someone who was a revolutionary in saying that multiracialism was good in the 1930s. Then he was seen as being bad because Salazar took it up and said this justified the wars in Africa. And then Freire supported the military regime. It is only in the last 2 or 3 years that his reputation has begun to be revived. And you really need to go and read his books. I mean, they're incredibly rich. Have you read his books?
Not well. Not complete.
They're just an amazing, rich mixture of everything. I mean, it's not the house and the slave quarter. It's not just the house and slave quarter. It's to do with how people ate, how people had their diets, how people adapted indigenous and African plants and animals, how they behaved sexually towards one another. And interestingly enough, miscegenation and interracial sexual relations. Freire was very much saw the master and the slave relationship continuing in that, and he saw there was a very sadistic element in the relationship, and he has a whole chapter on the sadism of the masters in their relationship with the slaves. So it's a very, I mean, you need to go back and retake it because it's a very, very rich, and the sociology that came in and the anthropology was very advanced for it. So,
the lady at the back who was wanting to ask.
Hello, I come from Freire's hometown, Recife, and we grew up with this idea of social democracy, or racial democracy in Brazil. But have these ideas delayed the process of us as a nation to realize that we are just as racist as America or South Africa?
Are you? Are you asking, are you? No, I actually, I don't think that's the case. I think there's a very interesting young man at Harvard who's in the law school who's writing a thesis, who's a black Brazilian from Minas Gerais, actually, who very much takes the view that Brazil is a very racist society. And I have to read his dissertation and comment on it. I'm the only white person he's allowed to be on his advisory committee. So there are Brazilians who take that position, and he's a very complicated dissertation. I mean, he's looked at all the legal procedures in Brazil and shows the way in which they're de facto racist. But I still think myself that Brazil is a very much more fluid and more multi-ethnic society than the US until very recently. The US has changed dramatically, actually, since I moved to the US. When I first went to the US in 1964, this was a period when students were driving down into the south and were killed. There were racist cops and things like that that killed them. There was a friend of mine from Princeton who went down and were killed. That was only 1964. And when I first went to Washington, D.C. in 1964, 65 to do some research in the Library of Congress, I went in to have my hair cut. And I thought people were very strange, they behaved very oddly to me. And I suddenly realized I was the only white person there, and I wandered into a black only barber shop. They cut my hair, but that Washington was a segregated city in 1964, 65, but nowadays students are not like that, and the young people are not like that, and there's been a remarkable change. So in a sense, the US has become more like Brazil, and Brazil has become more like the US in some sense, in racial terms. And it's certainly true among young people, very, very dramatically so.
Sir, back. Right to the back, even further.
Hi. I just had a question about the idea of the master and slave and that relationship that existed in Brazil. I want to compare that to the United States and Portugal's other colonies. I'm fascinated and curious that this relationship could even take place, this racial intermarriage. And I want to know, well, I'm just curious as to how it seems to have happened in Brazil on such a large scale. Despite all odds, I've read that this is something that the church didn't approve of. And I've heard stories that priests going into towns would provoke the slaves and their masters having to separate themselves so as to not be disapproved of. Yeah, I just wanted to know your thoughts as to why you think this happened on such a large scale in Brazil in comparison to the United States, which obviously didn't receive as many slaves from Africa as Brazil did. But where this type of racial mixing between master and slave didn't seem to take place, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, in the case of Brazil, and is that the relationships between blacks, between Africans and Europeans happened in Portugal much earlier, and the population in Lisbon, for example, in 20 or 30 years before the discovery of Brazil, I think it's about 10 or 15% of the population was African. And they were not all slaves. There was intermarriage in the period in the early 16th century in Portugal. This meant that institutions existed that were defined racially, but nonetheless were institutions that had representation within the society. And this had a lot to do with the organization of the church, or of sodalities, or of brotherhoods, and so that you would have a brotherhood that was black men or brown men, or various gradations of interracial mixture. And they all existed in Portugal prior to the settlement of Brazil. So when, so there's that element's important, it pre-existed. The other important thing is that Brazil was a very urban society in the colonial period. You're not just dealing with the rural masters and slaves in a rural setting. You're dealing with masters and slaves in an urban setting from the early period. And the cities that I mentioned, like Rio, Bahia, even Belém in the Amazon, Sao Paulo was more indigenous than it was African in this period. These institutions existed where people who were non-white had a representation in society that was recognized. The opposition to the Dutch by the Brazilian population was a multi-racial opposition. You had militias that were formed by blacks, by pardos, by brown people, by indigenous people, that were armed, that had colonels in the colonial period, in the 17th century. Now that shifted and changed in the 19th century, and probably, I'm not quite sure when, but probably in the 1820s and 1830s, particularly after the Haitian Revolution, where race became an issue of contestation. In other words, if you had a black militia in Brazil, you had for 300 years a black militia, it wasn't seen as a threat to the white establishment. But after the Haitian Revolution, whites began to worry about blacks with arms. So I think it was shifted and changed. So Brazil became, more racist after the independence period in the 1820s and 1830s than it was in the colonial period. But in the colonial period, these sodalities, these brotherhoods, these representative institutions, which would buy freedom for slaves, for example. There was the Rosario, the Brotherhood of the Rosario, was a black brotherhood in Brazil in the early period. It had been in Portugal in the early 16th century. It was in Brazil in the 16th, 17th century. It pooled its resources and bought the freedom of slaves with its members. So they had manumission through this institution at the center of society. The religious processions, for example, were all racially defined, but they were all recognized by society. And the leading ones were from the Rosario. In Minas Gerais, the leading, in the colonial period, the leading person who leads off the parade and the religious ceremonies is the Rosario fraternity of blacks, often most of them slaves. So it's a very different environment. It's a much more complex situation. It's dealing with 300 years here, 300 years of history. So I think that's part of the explanation why things are different in Brazil.
I see several hands. Can I ask, since the time is pressing, is there if somebody's got a question they'd really like to ask or a comment they'd like to make, which is sort of a broad application, let's have it. If not, if you can hold it and perhaps corner Kenneth Maxwell over a glass of wine, then we can all go and continue discussing. Does anybody want to have a burning point? Yes, this gentleman here. After that, we will then
shifting from race back to independence. I'm a PhD candidate at King's College, and I've been studying the Masonic career of Hipólito da Costa, the editor of the Correio Brasiliense. And in the early 1800s, there's evidence of Masonic lodges in the Northeast, in Pernambuco and Bahia, and they were relatively well established. From what I gather from your talk, there's a lot to be said, about the coming of the royal family to Brazil, the institutions that were then established. But could you problematize some more, because there were obviously alternative projects, political projects, Republican, more liberal project as opposed to the monarchical. So why was this single project victorious, let's say? Is it because of those institutions? Is it because of the royal family? Because it feels that Portugal basically gave the independence to Brazil without so much of a problematized issue for independence.
No, I don't think it gave it. I mean, this is the Portuguese mythology. The Portuguese think that they gave the independence. I mean, I remember when I was first doing research in Lisbon, I said I was going to study independence of Brazil. And the man said, there's no independence of Brazil. We gave the independence of Brazil. It's not worth studying. The Masonic thing is extremely important, and it's very linked to the British, because the head of the Masonic College of Costa was the secretary to the Duke of Sussex, who was the king's son, third son, something like that. It was very much part of the project, and that was very much linked. He was a Mason. And Joseph Bonifazio, who was the Patriarch of Brazilian Kenneth, was a Mason. Pedro I was a Mason. It came in, it's a little uncertain when it began, but probably in the late 18th century. But I think it was very much linked. Joseph Bonifazio was very much linked to the Minas conspirators in 1789. The failure of the Minas conspiracy and the Haitian Revolution and the Napoleonic takeover in France meant that many of the liberals who would in most circumstances become republicans became monarchists in Brazil. Like Joseph Bonifazio. Joseph Bonifazio was a classic liberal person, as was the Bonifazio Costa, but they were all monarchists. And the British were very much in favour of that, because they saw the monarchy as a guarantor of the unity of Brazil, which it was, in fact. Because, I mean, the interesting thing is when the Pernambucans tried to have a republic, they produced cotton, which if you have an economic interpretation of history, you would think the cotton merchants and the cotton importers of Lancashire would want to have cheap cotton from Brazil, which is much cheaper than the cotton later on that came from the US. But they didn't. They didn't support that. They didn't support Pernambuco as an independent republic state. They supported the central government and John Cochrane and the British Navy and all those people who thought in protecting the central government of the British. So I think it's a combination of circumstances. But things changed. They changed dramatically between 1800 and 1870. And it's very important to understand that, to explain why Brazil remained a monarchy for most of the history. And retained slavery, which is another interesting element, because Joseph Bonifazio was a great abolitionist, but he couldn't bring it back because the whole basis of the economy is based on slavery. And he was not having got rid of it. But he was a genuine abolitionist. So there's an odd mixture. But it's a very interesting topic. Have you looked at the Masonic archives? Because that's a fantastic topic.
Very good. I think on that note, we ought to finish. Invite you to come and have a glass of wine and continue the discussion. But I think we should, first of all, thank Professor Maxwell for a fascinating